And so that's all I would like to say what we mean by learn. And I would like to take inspiration from well-known topics in material science. This is sheet memory alloys, and I'm gonna watch I'm gonna show some movies from YouTube that you might have seen before. In sheet memory alloys, you have an individual, say let's call it an operators, that applies by hand some mechanical deformation on a wire, and by applying heat to the wire with the device and molding it in this shape. Here is called some A written and other shapes. Train the material to acquire this shape. Yeah, we're gonna call this stage is train. Then there's a second stage in which you take the shape that you had made before, you stretch the oil to some arbitrary shape there is nothing to do from the one you trained it for. You reapply heat, but not exactly shaping of the wire. And what you do is you retrieve the shape that you're creating. And some of you might have seen this. Is even more impressive in movies, of course. You see here, this is being trained. Now you undo, and not now you retrieve what you're trained for by applying just heat, and the shape that you're trained for is retrieved. Okay, so if you like, this is a simple example of what we call learning or retrieval in shape. Sometimes people use the word physical learning. Everything is physical, so I don't know if the expression is necessarily very well defined. But what it indicates is the desire to translate ideas that often originate in computer science, theory of neural network, the systems that are biological, physical, chemical, as you like. And of course, one of the heroes, I'm just copying here the title of the paper by Hopfield in 1982, which is the whole program of research in a sense, is neural networks and physical systems with emergent collective computational ability. Because it's pretty obvious that from the onset, the optimal model was intended as much as a model of computation, as a model of construction of physical system, of interpretation, potentially a biological one. And so, if you like, we are following with your debate that enduring source of inspiration. And there are some interesting examples that have been done. One of this is from the group of Dadu and Andrea Yu. This is a meta material that is constructed to perform learning in some form. But another paper that has been quite inspiring to us is this paper. This is a theoretical paper, but followed by federal impressive experimental feat, including by members of the audience here. This paper from 2015 by Arvind, Zorana Deracic, Michael Brenner, Stan Leibler. And in this paper, what the author talk about is instead of the simple retrieval of a shape of down wire that I showed in the previous slide, they're imagining learning how to self-assemble with molecular building block. And in that sense, I think this is perhaps even more connected to the topic of this conference. And not surprising, given that one of the organizers was the author of it. But one aspect that is sort of very distinctive about what is exposed there, and also the example that I showed with the shape memory alloy, is that different assembled structures, which are static, the lattice of a certain shape, are associated with fixed points of an energy landscape. And so the question that we'll address in this talk, and that's why it's called learning dynamical behavior, is what are the conditions for learning a dynamical behavior that entails a sequence of shapes or a sequence of states or a pathway. Just to summarize, that we're just saying that this example and many that followed, where this logic or learn is applied to self-assembly, each self-assembled state is coincide with the minima of an energy landscape or a free energy landscape. Okay, What we want to do now is dynamics. We want to learn something that changes in time. If you like, we want to learn how to sub-assemble and move. And not just in a distinctive manner, try to sub-assemble, then you move by point activation. We're going to put things that are active, and they will immediately assemble in a motion. Okay? I'm going to give you a concrete example momentarily. But you can already see that if that's what you want to do, you cannot start with a picture in which you associate the object that you want to assemble to a minima, to a fixed point, because otherwise that shit is going to be fixed. Okay? So we have to do something else. And we means this team of people. You see Rituparno Mandal, who was a postdoc. My group is now back in Bangalore as a faculty. Rosalind Wang was a PhD, it was an undergraduate actually, and now he's a PhD student at MIT. Michel Fouchard was a postdoc, now he's a faculty staff at the SPCI. Bernard Norman is in the audience and is the guest lecturer who will enlighten us on the potential experimental application of this work. Arvind Murugan, Norm and Suri, both of them have spoken, and Marco has recently joined the team. So what are the conditions for learning dynamical behavior in physical systems in a sort of platform-independent way, although we got to use some examples, no doubt. So again, to spell out what we would like to do, in this talk, remember the first example, we're going to have always a training stage and a retrieval or deployment one. So now our training stage will be to apply, let's say, to this origami bird, some periodic motion that causes the limit cycle, which in this case is just flapping the wing. And then our desire would be that even if this structure is realized with microscopic building blocks, the colloid or anything that undergo over that diameter, the quantity that would not have oscillation proprietary, and still learn to acquire this dynamical function. Okay? So notice we don't want to just assemble the shape. We want that shape to move in some sort of periodic motion, even if in that world inertia doesn't exist and that periodic motion is not given to you for free. Okay? We want to learn, if you like, how to do an effective inertia, even in microscopic set. That's clear? And by inertia, just this is a figurative expression. Anything that is a limit cycle, a dynamical state. Okay? And to analyze this problem, we want to sort of go a little bit back to the foundation of how we think about many-body systems. And, this is a somewhat schematic slide that I decided to do with a thin degree of freedom. Not that we're going to be dealing with this thing, but just to simplify the analysis, in the spirit of what I hope to do it. The first line is something that you probably know very well. It's an Ising model expressed in terms of an Hamiltonian. And of course, accompanying this Hamiltonian that tells you the energy landscape, there is a dynamical equation for how the spin evolves. And this dynamical equation has a very simple form. You take the energy, you take a derivative of the energy with respect to the degree of freedom, which is the spin variable, and you get this first order equation. If you like, dTs equal the derivative of the variation of the energy with respect to the other part. Okay? And in order for that to be the case, you need Jij to be symmetric. And this is a fact that we're, I would say rather transparent mathematically, but not always imprecise. Why is that? If Jij was not symmetric, but it had, for example, an antisymmetric part, if not if even algebra this, it's taking it symmetric and an antisymmetric. If there was an antisymmetric part, meaning that when I flip the two indices I and j, I actually flip the sign of the object. When I multiply this object by time it looks like SI/SJ. So I was saying that crucial in having this, if you like, variational dynamics, in which the dynamical equation comes from a variation of an Hamiltonian, is the condition that Jij must be symmetric under exchange of I and j. I have to say, in simple terms, you want spin I to interact with spin j in the same way that spin j interacts with spin I. Okay? Mathematically, if you have an Hamiltonian like this,
and your matrix Jij had an antisymmetric part, or odd, which means that when you flip I and j, instead of giving you the same thing, it picks up a minus sign, you can sort of see that you can flip I and j here and nothing happens. But if you flip I and j here, you pick up a minus sign. Okay, so having something like this implies that h is equal to minus h, and the only thing that has that property is 0. Okay? So it means that anything of this form will not contribute to the energy, even if it can manifestly contribute to the dynamical equation. That means that there are some terms in your equation of motion that do not come from varying the energy. Okay? And loosely speaking, having this condition means that I and j, the 2 degrees of freedom, have equal objective functions. Okay? If they have unequal objective function, and most crucially incompatible ones, then it's clear that they cannot reach a common minima, a common fixed points. Now, that may sound like a pathology, and maybe in some cases it is, but it's also an opportunity, like most pathologies. Why? And sometimes this fact, that of course could be simply called symmetric or asymmetric, is called reciprocal, where you take a more sort of human-like language for describing. Now, non-reciprocal would be an equation of motion of exactly the same form, but now you allow the Jij not to be symmetric. Okay? Now, what happens in that case? Let me play just a little movie. Let's assume that this spin degrees of freedom now have maybe even objective goals. So let's say that the blue one wants to align with the red one, and the red line wants to anti-align with the blue one. Okay? Then what happens is this dance that you're going to see. The red anti-aligns, the blue aligns. You see, they literally chase each other because they don't have a common function. So this dynamics of this 2 spin, simple as it may appear, immediately creates a cycle, even at the level of the interaction between 2. I would like to stress, please notice that this is a bit different, actually very, in my opinion, different, from adding a magnetic field that coupled linearly to a single spin, and then making the magnetic field go up and down. Okay? This is really messing with the way these guys interact. And this messing with, excuse my technical language, implies that Jij, or more precisely, the dynamical equation, does not come from a variation of an energy. That's all we've done. Okay? So this cannot occur in passive system or in closed system. You need a system in contact with an environment from which the energy to sustain this oscillation will be provided, this limit cycle. Please.
So it implies that you need components that can dissipate energy.
Yeah, so actually what this means is even worse than that. Because dissipate, I mean, we know what it is. Depending, you'll see it in a moment, depending on how you go along the cycle, whether clockwise or counterclockwise, you can either release energy or absorb it. So there's also the possibility of acquiring it. Okay? So this is really describing little engines. Okay? And so now you can see the question, the logic here, even from a statistical mechanics perspective. You know, the Ising model is a model, the ordinary one, in which you study how a tendency of 2 spins to align would propagate in the presence of noise to macro scales to give you an ordered state. The question here is going to be how the propensity of building blocks to undergo a microscopic motion survives across scale in the presence potentially of noise to give you a coordinated time-dependent function. Okay? Please.
It's not easy for them to decouple.
Say again?
The other solution for them just to decouple. Then we can just decouple and then...
Yeah, so one thing that is going to happen here is that if I literally did what I described, and I would have a symmetric part, an anti-symmetric one, and noise, there could be a, how to say, disorder state, where they effectively decouple and equal probability they do whatever they want. They're going to be an ordered one, and there's going to be a phase diagram. And the line of that phase diagram will also mark transition between static phases and dynamical one, and there will be a certain set of bifurcation of the underlying non-variational dynamical system. And that's where, painfully slowly, I'm trying to move towards. Now, this is a non-reciprocal system. It's an interesting idea, and you can see why it may be useful for us to build up this dynamical picture of self-assembly. And actually, simple as it may be, when you embed this idea in the physics of phase transitions, in the physics of turbulence, or in the physics of elasticity, by having moduli that are odd, or viscosity that are odd in the same sense, you can get physics that is considerably richer, as you can imagine. You always throw this non-equilibrium angle to it. And of course, I mean, there's a tradition of working along those lines in neuroscience, Wilson, Coe, and Hoffield himself, okay? So, and just to give you another fun example, what you have here is robots that have been programmed to have this antisymmetric interaction, and they are on a plane. They're like spins, XY spins. A normal XY spin will spontaneously break a direction and a line. What these guys do instead is that they rotate like this. Notice that there's no external torque that we programmed. We only programmed the interaction. This is just a little demo, nothing fancy. But there is a chiral symmetry breaking, spontaneous, meaning these guys are all rotating. They have a fixed relative angle, the velocity of the two of them, but they rotate. Okay? And the thing that I want to draw your attention to is that the order parameter is itself moving. These blue and red lines are the average of the velocity. Just for comparison, if you had flocking, that is always called a non-equilibrium phase transition of phase, if everybody flocks in one direction, if I plot the velocity field, it's fixed in time. So there the birds move, but the order parameter stays static. Here it's really a phase where the order parameter is itself represented by a moving. And in fact, there's two of them. Okay? So
animation is going faster than the order
yeah, because it's been done very poorly by people who are neither experimentalists. No. I mean, this is just a demo for fun, right? But there are actually experimental settings that people have, gone through, and maybe I'll say a bit more about that at the end.
So, comparing with flocking, would this correspond to, say, a swarm of birds which are going around and round?
Yeah. I mean, I can even, let me see if I have a picture of what you want. I think what the question is so flocking, it's typically this situation here, sometimes described by the exact model. So this is the disordered state with the decouple. Here with the couple, and all the birds are moving, but they have this fixed direction of motion, which is spontaneously broken. And in technical language, you can literally describe this as a pitchfork bifurcation in a modified Turner 2 equation. But if, on the other hand, you now say, well, I have two birds types, and don't be particularly stuck on the ornithological explanation, because it's not really meant to describe any species of bird. But if you write down the corresponding equation, which are the equation of an XY model, you just add essentially the self-propulsion. Now what you're going to see is, again, these are the order parameters rotating, but the birds, or the pseudo birds, are undergoing this cyclic motion in a circle, but not because they're charged particle in a magnetic field, that they will do it in isolation. They do it because of how two of them interact in this strange way. Okay, so this is all I wanted to say to introduce it in a very simple setting, this idea. But this is only intro, because this is not learning yet. It's not learning yet because our interaction, while interesting or non-reciprocal, is still frozen. Is not evolving in time. So we don't have the aspect of the plastic deformation that you were doing in the alloy when you apply heat and you were deformed. In order to have that conceptually, you need an equation of motion also for the Jij. Okay? During the period that we called training, the Jijs are being changed. The way the particles would interact, it continuously evolve until you reach a state determined by the function that you want to learn. Then you stop, you learn that, you deploy in the real world, and with those Jij that you've determined, you will see, hopefully, something going on. Please.
So the Jij are like the weights in the neural networks.
Yeah.
So just like they are tuned by background.
Yeah.
You are actually tuning them.
Yeah, evolving, I would say.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would like to say is that is directional, because Jij is different from Jji. So on that bond, there has to be a, if you like, an arrow, if you, which I didn't draw here, but, or two arrows opposite to indicate the relative strength. Okay, all of this is good. And then by now you know that I have this unhealthy fascination with toys. So let's try to instantiate this very simple idea with toy before doing something a touch more sophisticated and gradually evolving towards potential experimental proposals or inspiration. So what do we have here? Again, this is a kit you can buy for less than $100. Is usually aimed for people of 7 to 12-year-old. So everybody in this room is probably overqualified to play with them, but there's no harm. So what do you see here? What you see here, it's an evolution on the Legos that are my favorite experimental platform. So these are Lego robotics, okay? So this Lego piece can rotate as if it was a freely jointed bar, but inside these little controllers, there's something that you can program, very much like the other guys in the previous slides. And so what we are gonna do is, so the degrees of freedom here are these angles, okay? And we wanna program the following interaction. So this is the equation of motion. This equation of motion is the same equation that if you write down an XY model that wants to align the spin, you take a variation, right? Because to align them, you take the cosine of the difference in the angle, take a variation, gives you the sine. Okay, so nothing particularly fancy there. What we are doing, though, is we are programming just by hand. So this is a pretty stupid exercise, demonstrational mostly, the evolution for Jij. And we're just choosing it. It's going to be whatever, some term linear in Jij, a cubic nonlinearity. And then I would like to stress this your attention to this kernel here. Okay, so this kernel here says, well, first thing I want to show you, this G could be an exponential. Now notice that if I flip I and J in this expression, you say, well, it's a cosine, nothing happens. However, I and J are associated with T and T prime. So flipping I and J also implies flipping T and T prime. And if this is an exponential decay, it will not give you something symmetric in Jij. Because what this kernel is doing is implementing a time delay, okay, between the information passing from one to the other, okay? Now I can ask, and this thing that I wrote up here, spike time-dependent plasticity, this is just a term used in neuroscience to indicate the existence of these delays. And the reason why I want to bring it up is because the classic, or the simplest form of Hebbian learning rule, fire together, wire together. Well, here you're not firing together because there's a delay. Okay, so that's what we're messing with. Okay, so this is a toy, and now with this toy, armed with this toy, I can ask the following question. Let me perform the two stages of my scheme: training and retrieval. Okay, so what's training going to be? Training is going to be grabbing by hand these two guys, moving the angle around. By moving the angle, this dynamics is switched off. By moving this angle around, I change the J's, okay, in a way that I decide to mimic some functionality that I want to learn. This is the operator. So this is going to be done on the next movie. Hopefully you can see all of them. So I'm now training in a way that, goes back and forth with no specific net motion, okay? I'm saying that, loosely speaking, that the training is time reversal symmetric. Okay? And now I want to know, once I've done this charade, I move left and right. I only have this equation because the dynamics is switched off. I'm going to land on some Jij's. What I want to know is that if I now do retrieval, so switch off this, what do I learn? And the thing that you're going to see is that, maybe perhaps intuitive, hopefully intuitive, is that what I learn, it's symmetric interaction. Okay? In other words, this system that has been trained with time reversal symmetric motions only learn fixed points. Okay? So if you think conceptually, what we're trying to do is, in terms of hardware, we have implemented in this toy the possibility of generating JIJs that are non-symmetric. And now we're asking, what type of protocol in terms of software should we apply to the learning procedure in order to retrieve a dynamical functionality, which in this case would be something pretty trivial, obviously. So let's do something else. Let's do the training, go back to the training, in a time reversal, sorry, in a way that breaks time reversal symmetry. And you'll see it by eye what that means. Let's just go clockwise. In fact, counter clockwise or clockwise, you can pick, but pick one, net. Okay, so this has been our training. Since I moved by hand I and j in a way that I've decided is different from before, I'm going to land on some jij that are going to be different from the one that I landed before. Now, get this jij that I obtained by this, stop the training, and start touching them with the jij, to see the dynamics generated by the jij that I created. Okay, let's do the touching. I touch. Notice that now they pick up a limit cycle, a cyclic motion. Okay, why? Because they now learned the asymmetric one, and they learned it because the exposure to example, not only the hardware is able to generate it, but the exposure to example has been examples that know about the breaking of the arrow of time. So this is a rather intuitive, although, I mean, it's not super easy to formalize, but what we're just saying, and I'm going to say how to analyze it, is that two ingredients are needed in what we've done, at least. Non-reciprocal interaction have to be able to generate it in principle by the hardware, and B, you have to train with example the break time reversal symmetry. Okay. Now, if you say, well, let's do the ultimate exercise in futility, we're going to do a toy model of the toy. Okay, that will turn out to be, though, the first step towards a poor man non-reciprocal or asymmetric upfield model. Okay, so what you can do is, instead of doing xy like this, you can do literally a spin, Ising spin. And now this is your simplified evolution equation for jij. And the only thing I want to draw your attention to is the presence of this tau. This is the time delay. Okay, this is where I'm deviating from wire together, fire together, wire together, by having this tau that is non-zero. Okay, because that is what is going to make this jij acquire potentially a non-symmetric part. So what this little plot is showing is the following situation. So on the left is training, on the right is retrieval. On the left, first I apply a training in which I oscillate the spins like this, okay? But while I and j are in phase. Okay? Now, there's no way of saying who is ahead of the other, okay? And as I apply this perturbation by hand, the j's are changing because this is a training period. And as you know, they both start, minus and plus here means symmetric and antisymmetric, okay? I think the minus is the antisymmetric, just to be really sure, because I realize maybe what I'm really meaning is, maybe divided by 2. A j plus is the same thing. Actually, how about I do this? The plus is we're having a plus there. Okay, is this all right? So notice that as time evolves, at the beginning, they may even be 0, this coupling, but they will evolve with this equation. And the -1 will stay 0. Whereas the +1, they will gradually inch towards a finite value. Now I switch off the training, which means I switch off this equation. I go here. I play a movie, and I'm going to see that, sorry, it's here, the corresponding. Both I and j will converge to a value that is fixed in time. Now, second case, let's expose it to a training, some dynamics, the I and j, that knows that there's one ahead of the other. Note the pink is ahead in phase to the yellow, okay? Let's do that. And now let's look how during that training the j's evolve. They still start being 0. Now, on average, the positive symmetric one will stay very small, but the other one will actually converge to something finite, the asymmetric one. And when I go in the retrieval stage, switch this off, take this value, not surprising perhaps in the light of what you've seen, the red, the pink and the yellow will undergo oscillations, okay? Approaching what seems like a cycle, okay? So that's a very simple, if you like, model where you can do almost everything by hand, you know, and you can generalize it to the XY model. It works even better because the larger the space of this variable, the better you can learn more complex patterns. This is a general fact. Now,
what about the period of oscillations? Does it match what you trained it with, or it doesn't? The temporal period.
So what you can do, I don't have it on this slide, is you can do a fidelity plot. Maybe you can, even if the dynamics of the learning process is non-variation, you can still ask, how do I deviate in terms of a cost function from what I put in? And that depends, as always, on how far you are in terms of initial conditions, the complexity of the function that you're trying to learn. Please notice that I cherry pick things that are nearly trivial by doing. If you want me to do, you know, to draw an A in space or the letter of the alphabet, I'll do very poorly. So there's not a generic answer, but I can plot it and quantify it. Okay, and it depends also, you know, where you start in phase space, because you have to reach always this thing. This is the principal thing. Sorry.
How important is the cubic term Ising model? If it were linear or
Here is not very important. In fact, in a new version that we're preparing, we're actually doing even simpler ones. Now, in principle, yes. And if so if you want more complex, you know, dynamics, and you do what you wanted, right, the fidelity, you'll see that especially if you put noise, or if you start with an initial condition that is really 0, you may not reach there just because you're not finding that attractor. So yeah, you are bound. But I don't have a rule to, I mean, I can draw a diagram of the various attractors and the more components you have, the more it helps. But I cannot still guarantee, because if I increase the component and you increase the complexity of what you want to read, there's always a breaking point. A little bit, because this is what we're doing now. So notice the progression: Ising, XY. The next thing I'm going to do is spin glasses. Okay, there and potentially with end component, and where Jij is not even frozen. So I'm going to give myself a whole distribution, and there I can really talk about capacity and all of these things. Loosely speaking, it increases, but how is the question?
For two spins, you only have two variables,
Yeah.
G minus and G plus. So there is not a lot of stuff you can encode, except the period is encoded in absolute. Provided that G plus is 0, then G minus encodes the time period.
Yeah.
But if you, I guess maybe that's what Paul was trying to ask, and I'm interested in to encode something non-periodic behavior, some kind of funny.
Oh, that is not.
Periods. Then you need more than 2 spins. And,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Now, I think you guys are in some level anticipating the next slides. I mean, like the Opfield model, even, you know, I call that a toy, or what do you call it, poor man Opfield, but it's really poor man because there's also no disorder. Another thing that you guys didn't maybe yet pick, but you can also do that, is how about Jij as a distribution? Okay. Now, there is a long tradition of thought that about how to say Opfield model with asymmetric interactions. In particular, there are works by also Sarah Sola, but I singled out here one by Sompolinsky and collaborator Crisanti. Please note the date to see that they were definitely not doing this thing for the first time. But what Sompolinsky and Crisanti did, and others, said, and to some extent, Opfield was perfectly aware of that. I'm going to show you the quotes from his paper. But in a sense, Opfield, in the first pass he did at this problem, he wanted to make his life a little bit easier by resuming an Hamiltonian structure, assuming that the Jij were symmetric, so that he could use a lot of the machinery that we're familiar with. But you know, this assumption was removed in later work. But one of the somewhat unpleasant consequences of that is that while it's certainly true that an asymmetric interaction between two such spins builds a cycle of rotation or a little clock, it's by no means obvious that when all these JIJs are random, all this clock will somehow synchronize into a coherent motion. In fact, your best guess would be probably that you're going to get chaos. And of course, Sompolinsky and Crisanti, they collaborated, the detailed analysis, they showed that it generically, any amount of non-symmetry in the Hopfield model, and more generally in spin glasses, causes chaos. The models, the class of models that they considered in the language of spin glasses, I'm not going to elaborate too much, is all-to-all coupling, where Jij is just drawn randomly and non-symmetric. So what and we means Giulia Garcia Lorenzana, who is a PhD student, yes, a PhD student at the École Normale, and next year will be here as a fellow at the NITMB, a postdoctoral fellow. Ada Altieri, who is a faculty in Paris. Michel, that you heard, is a faculty in Paris. And my friend and collaborator, Giulio Biroli, who is at the École Normale Supérieure. And so with these guys, we said, okay, how about we make a little tweak on the standard setup of the spin glasses studied by these guys. And we ask, how does the propensity towards chaos depends on how you distribute the connectivity of this bond? And we pose the problem that is a little bit different. Imagine that what you were interested is the following problem. I want to do a theory of many agents, each of which is a spin glass. Okay? And each complex agent will be a spin glass with symmetric interactions, okay, the ones that we know how to deal. But now there's two types of agents, A and B, each of them is a spin glass, symmetric within themselves, but they interact with each other as if they with non-symmetric interactions. So this would be having, like, for example, two neural networks with like in GAN, for example, antagonistically playing against each other, two complex agents. When you do that, you can demonstrate, this is a paper in PRL that is coming, that chaotic dynamics get suppressed, and you can restore the oscillations. Okay, if you do that, I want to also say you can also make things a little bit more complex. This is a work done inspired directly by Hopfield. What Hopfield wrote back in the days is, he said, look, he draws the attention to something that seems like a detail. If you update these J's, do you do it synchronously or asynchronously? Seems almost like a detail of how you do the simulation, but he immediately correctly understood. Asynchrony was deliberately introduced to represent a combination of propagation delay, jitter, and noise in real neural system. Notice always the perspective of doing something that is embedded in the physics or the engineering of the system. And what he noticed that it proves to be much more difficult to persuade a collection of neurons to move from one state to another, to retrieve, if that's what we're doing. And so he again pointed out, along with many others, that asynchronous Hopfield fails to learn sequence of patterns because of chaos. So as you can imagine, in work with another NIMTB fellow, Federico Gogman, Michel, and Giulio, we have recently, this is in preparation, generalized this to non-reciprocal Hopfield model with asynchrony. And I noticed that I only have 5 minutes, so let me just get you the bottom line. In this case, you can have retrieval of sequences being enhanced because one species knows about the other at the previous time. Okay, once you increment this asymmetry. And here you can actually do a plot, even with the capacity of this neural network. And notice that besides chaos, there's also a phase where you can learn sequences. Now, having said that, I want to use the remaining minute to return to something that resembles physics. Let's leave spins. How do we import all of this song and dance that we're learning in the toy model to a world populated by particles? Okay. So I'm going to assume that I have some particles that emit a field. Think of it as a pheromone field or a concentration of an oil. and I have many such particles. So the system is highly heterogeneous. I labels the index of the particles. This particle concentration field diffuses. The dynamics of the particle is such that the particle can move by self-propulsion. They interact with each other. But the crucial point, and here you'll see the similarity of what I've been talking up to now, is that this Ni, the direction in which it moves, is determined by gradients of the oil or whatever it is that the other particle emits. And how much the gradient emitted by this particle affects this other one is given by this mobility, omega ij. Okay? This is what is going to represent in this particle-based language the jij of the spins. And now I write down an equation for the omega ij. And this equation says that the learning rule for the omega ij is that the mobility increases when a particle I detects a greater than energy value, an average value of Cj. This is the equivalent of the evolution rule for the jij. Okay? The non-reciprocity in the system comes from the fact that when a particle is in the comet of the C emitted by the other, he sees that, whereas the one in front doesn't see the one behind. Okay? But that asymmetry evolves in time. Okay? So I'm going to show you the consequence of doing that, and then Pepin maybe can tell you how to actually. Pepin, you want to tell just one, if you give me 1 minute more, we take it from the question. I want Tim to say just a little bit how this could potentially come in an experiment.
Okay, I'm good. You know, it was a bit linear without the interruption from the.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
That was a joke.
Yeah.
That's humor. Yeah, go ahead.
But it's not crucial, I think, for your story.
No, it is.
Okay. But we.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Okay, we made droplets right a long time ago with Lorenz Zarzar that have this non-reciprocal interaction that chase each other. So where one droplet expels a gradient that makes other droplets attract, and the other droplets expel a gradient that repel the first droplet. And so when you put them next to each other, then the droplet that repels goes in, chases after the droplet that attracts. And so, this is sort of schematically drawn here. And the way this works is just that you have oils that want to mix by micellar solubilization, but the mixing is asymmetric because only one of the two oils dissolves in the other oil. And so you get some flow of oil from one droplet to the other, and that drives this asymmetric interaction. And so the idea was you could teach this behavior potentially, because the sort of behavior of which droplet is predator and which droplet is prey sits in the composition of the droplet, in what their oils are. And the composition can change over time if you push them through each other, because the droplet behind will pick up more from the oil that is solubilized in the droplet that is in front. And so by first pushing them and then releasing droplets, we could sort of train this compositional change and this behavior. That was the idea. Okay.
And
I don't know. Did you include a movie of moving droplets?
No.
No. Okay. But I can show you later. Okay.
Yeah. And especially we all agree that when Pepin goes back, he starts doing this experiment. That would be great. Sorry, I mean, I'm being a bit cheesy here. Now, I want to say that, of course, I mean, it's great to have concrete ideas. But if I switch back the idiot's theorist hat and I integrated this equation, take away the C out of here, now I get an equation in terms of the Green's function of that. And this equation in terms of Green's function that loses all the beauty of the specific of the physics of Pepin tells me that as long as this Green function are retarded, actually, let me just read it. Time asymmetric delay in the learning rule emerges from any causal non-instantaneous interaction embedded in this Green function. Translated in English, as long as you have a delay, which is any propagation, any interaction on Earth, and as long as that delay is seizable on the time scale of your dynamics, you'll have this effect. Big, sizable, whatever that is the word. Okay, and in fact, what does that sizable or whatever English word I should use mean for Pepin? Peclet number. Because and also notice when I was saying with the toy, switch off this. I mean, somebody comes, okay, how am I going to do this in an experiment? How do I switch off the training? Okay, so the Peclet number is, characteristic size, velocity at which I move this guy divided by diffusion. Depending on whether this Peclet number is high or small, when it's small, I can switch off this equation, meaning that this dynamic is essentially suppressed. When the Peclet number is large, that is to say, during training, if Pepin moves this damn particle fast, then he's going to change the omega ij. And if it then, when he releases them, they move not as fast as how he commanded them, then they will just follow this tree equation with what he has learned. That's how you do. You set up the separation of time scale. Okay? And now here is an example, and then the 2 more slides, I'm done. So one, they're connected. So what you do here, first training, you impose a motion. Okay? When you impose a motion, the motion is rotatory. The omega i's evolve from 0. And notice that since I've broken time reversal symmetry, I pick up the omega ij and the omega ji are different. So I picked up the antisymmetric part. Now in the retrieval, this was done at high Peclet. Now I go to low Peclet. And I start with something that is a random distribution of this guy. Notice that the evolution for the omega is switched off, but the other 3 are there. And notice what happens when I integrate it with the omega ij's. They assemble this disk. And they form that. And you can do the same song here. Move this 6 particle chasing a prey in yellow. This is the training. And now I do the retrieval. Notice they're not even assembled. The retrieval, the training was a high Peclet. Now it's a low Peclet. Notice what happens during the retrieval. They make this sort of spaceship object. They chases the poor guy there and catches it. This is an example where the learning is also something that is not quite identical to what you saw, but I've even generalized it a little bit, you could say. And with that, I really should stop and say thank you. Only to say that what we're studying now is how does this cycles, chiral things, propagate across scales. And with that, let me thank you for your attention.
Questions?
Alexei, announce on
Yes,
Zoom,
I will.
people can ask questions via Q&A.
I will open Q&A. Oh,
I'm just wondering if it's possible to find analogy with a kind of well-established physical system with the speed of interactions, for example, speed of light, and so on, and find this analogy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, actually, it's not an analysis, not even an analogy. It's a math thing.
Yeah.
The only thing is that my first pick would not be light. Not because light doesn't have a Cherenkov radiation, but because essentially the parameter that matters is that the speed at which you're moving this particle in some regime has to be large enough compared to the speed of propagation of the signal.
What gravity?
Well, sound, it's an obvious choice, especially medium with low elastic moduli. And that's even been implemented, I believe. The other one is where the dynamics itself is more diffusive, which is what they have there. And then you can really slow it down and get in that regime very easily. But your intuition is perfectly right. There's a ratio of speed. The speed at which you move by hand the particle during training and relative to the speed of propagation of the signals.
And so there is, I assume it will be also some kind of like retardation effect analogous to van der Waals when you, which is kind of like we'll get into the
all of this thing,
yeah.
all of these things. And sorry if I group them in one box, but that's exactly what I was joking about, that all the beauty of the specific physics gets in the property of this green function that has retardation effect. That's exactly it. And since they are inevitable, the only question is to what extent you can control them, sweep between one being larger and the other one being smaller. And these are the 2 regimes, retrieval and train. That's exactly it. That's why it's really what we're doing, in my mind, while inspired by experiment, is really more like a blueprint, potentially, to do this in other platforms. And it's up to you to, I bet that people can imagine things more intelligent than what we have. I mean, certainly more than the spin and the toys.
Ecosystems. You had an example of an ecosystem on one of your slides. So how far have you sort of advanced in your thinking about applying this to ecosystems with evodynamics being being learned?
Coevolution. Yeah, no, absolutely. So what we're doing at the moment is to deploy this in areas in biology. That is an obvious case. I wish I could report to you a fully worked out example. I can't at the moment. Maybe if we talk later, later meaning a year from now or something. But I would like to point out that Julia and Giulio are studying a lot these systems and the effect of asymmetry, not only in the rate of growth and death, which is Lotka-Volterra, but potentially also in a spatially extended system of diffusion coefficients that are cross-diffusion coefficients that are symmetric. It starts being explored. What I've done in excruciating detail is something even more crazy. I study human behavior. There is a paper that we have on the archive with Danny Sierra called Sociohydrodynamics. And in a data-driven manner, we took census data in the United States. Of course, this is a completely different problem, but with census data, you could have different groups, voters of different parties, people that recognize themselves in different racial groups. All this information is available, and by census sect. And as you can imagine, there's a very, I don't know if you can imagine, but there's a very famous problem in economics. Schelling, who won the Nobel Prize, studied racial segregation dynamics, but without space. I mean, I guess he didn't have all of these PDEs. He didn't even, he did it at the time in which he invented Monte Carlo by doing trials. So he's really a pioneer. What we did is we took all of this data in conjunction with social surveys, because humans are like, including myself, are like bacteria, they talk more. And they answer social survey. They can literally say, that identify in group A, with what probability would I move in a neighborhood that has group B in more than this percentage? And this data is available. So with that data, you can write down utility functions for the mobility, okay, calibrated with data. Then you can construct hydrodynamic model that tells you how people are going to move in relation to those choices that they say they want to do. And assuming that they don't lie, you have hydrodynamic equations with diffusion coefficients that are non-symmetric. And the equivalent of the time-dependent phase is, instead of integration and segregation, which are widely abundant in the data for the US, you could at least in principle have migration. And even in neighborhoods, this is known. Sometimes, I don't know, the Italians move out of Little Italy, and there's another community that almost in block takes over. This is now no longer a steady state. This is a dynamic.
You should be able to see how artists start gentrifying communities and they're being displaced by bankers.
Absolutely. If you add, I mean, and you can make an hypothesis or have a survey or something where you extract the utility function. So that's not ecology, but is an example. And the final one that I showed at the end, I mean, as you noticed, I already abused my time, but this is something I'm very excited that we're hoping to finish soon. If it was possible to take off this.
It is possible.
There's one version of this non-reciprocity that I find particularly intriguing in elasticity. In elasticity, you can have moduli that do not enter the equation of elastodynamics, but they don't represent deformation, changes in the elastic energy. It's almost paradoxical. It's called odd elasticity, this thing. And it also involves forces that are non-conservative. So you can have this cycle that you return to where you started and you do work. So the question that we've asked is the following. You may know that this thing of Pasteur. Pasteur scratched barrels of wine and extracted some crystals. And by looking at the macroscopic chirality of crystals, he could determine the chirality of the molecules that these crystals were made of. Okay? So the idea that we have is the following. Of course, why do I bring chirality? Because once you have cycle, of course, it's a dynamical chirality. So the question that we have, of course, in biology, maybe this may resonate with those who have this origin of life perspective. In biology, chirality also propagates across scales. Quite literally from the molecules of life that are virtually all chiral to the position of the organs in my body. And by chirality, it means breaking of mirror symmetry. And so what we did is the following. For us, the scales we want to connect are the cellular scale, where inside the cell there may be chiral processes, and the macro scale of morphogenesis, of flow of a whole bunch of cells in a tissue. And we've taken data from the group of Pascal Silberzan that, this is some unpublished work, that had observed some flow that were not mirror symmetric using a combination of machine learning and the continuum and theory from microscopic model, we have inferred microscopic mechanism of chirality within a single cell. And this microscopic mechanism of chirality rely on the elastic version of these non-reciprocal interactions. And I'm hoping that, and this has data, because I think, and it's biological. Not ecological, but biological. But it is ecology, it goes towards the ecology in the following sense. So, in fact, I want to call it living mechanics. Because, so, you know, to me, the nice thing about life is that you can be born and you can die. I mean, maybe the being born part is better than the other, but this is to come hand in hand. So in this medium, there is an elasticity that is strange. That means that you can compress a system, and that causes transverse responses. Okay. So what these cells are doing, they are modulating their proliferation rate in a spatially dependent manner. So they're doing a self-pinches at the edge by proliferating more there. By proliferating more there, they cause a compression. And that compression, by means of this non-reciprocal elasticity, gives you these flows. So it's a combination of building blocks that are chiral and active, and the fact that you can modulate in space the degree at which you exude, which is death, or you proliferate. And this mixture with a growth equation for the number of cells and an odd viscoelastic model causes this process. And we can track it all the way to microscopic in a quantitative way. So stay tuned.